Tell them what you saw." Patrick Fletcher's voice cracked like a whip across the dead silence of the Redemption Creek courthouse, his dark eyes burning with something caught between desperation and fury. "Tell them, Miss Carter, right now, before they hang me for something I did not do." Minnie Carter stood in the center of that sweltering room, 37 faces turned toward her, and she felt the weight of every single one of them pressing against her chest like a physical force. The judge, a heavy man named Arlo Dempsey, whose honor was bought and paid for, she suspected, leaned forward from behind his high bench and studied her with the kind of eyes that had already decided the verdict before anyone walked through the door. The courtroom smelled of pine resin and old sweat, and the particular sourness of a crowd that had gathered not to witness justice, but to watch a man fall. She had arrived in Redemption Creek exactly 11 days ago. She had planned to stay 3. And now Patrick Fletcher, the man whose cattle empire sat 3 miles north of town, the man whose voice she had first heard barking orders at a field hand, and whose face she had first seen silhouetted against a sunset that turned the Oklahoma Territory sky the color of burnished copper. That man was staring at her from across a courtroom with chains on his wrists, accused of murder, and the only thing standing between him and a rope was the fact that Minnie Carter had an extraordinary, almost frightening gift. She never forgot anything she read, not a word, not a punctuation mark, not a ledger entry, not a land deed, not a contract clause buried in paragraph 17 of a document that most men would have skimmed and signed without thinking. She had memorized everything, and the hidden truth that lived inside the pages she had studied the night before could save him or bury him entirely, depending on what she chose to do next. She drew a slow breath. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear as a church bell in winter air, "I intend to testify, all of it. Every word." And somewhere beneath the panic and the stakes and the dark shadow of a trap she had not fully seen coming, she felt the electric, impossible thing that had been building between her and Patrick Fletcher for the past 11 days rise up inside her like a tide she could no longer hold back. But that is not where this story starts. It starts 11 days earlier, on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1883, when the stagecoach from Dodge City jolted to a grinding halt outside the Redemption Creek General Store, and a woman stepped down from the coach with a leather satchel over one shoulder, a crate of school books balanced against her hip, and dust on every inch of her traveling clothes. Minnie Carter was 26 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, which was not particularly impressive until you noticed the way she carried herself, straight-spined, chin level, eyes moving across a new town the way a surveyor's eyes move across land, cataloging and calculating. She had brown hair that she kept twisted at the back of her neck because loose hair in Oklahoma wind was a war you could not win, and she had eyes the color of creek water in late summer, greenish-brown and very clear, the kind of eyes that made people feel she was looking slightly through them rather than at them. She had been a traveling teacher for 4 years. Before that, she had been a student in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolmaster who recognized early that his daughter possessed something unusual and nurtured it with relentless care. She could read a page of text twice and recite it back verbatim 2 weeks later. Legal documents, medical texts, agricultural reports, Bible verses, territorial law, deed records, it made no difference. Once it entered Minnie Carter's mind, it stayed there with perfect fidelity, organized and retrievable as books on a well-maintained shelf. The Oklahoma Territorial Education Board sent her where she was needed most, which was always the roughest, most underfunded, most forgotten corners of the frontier. She had established schoolrooms in sod houses, in saloon back rooms during off hours, once memorably in the upper loft of a livery stable, because it was the only structure tall enough to stand upright in. She taught arithmetic, reading, grammar, geography, and history to children ranging from age 5 to 16, and she did it with a calm authority that made even the most reluctant frontier fathers stop arguing and let their children attend. Redemption Creek was her assignment for October. The town had 43 children of school age and no permanent teacher, since the last one had married a rancher and retired from teaching 18 months ago. The territorial board had found a vacant room above the feed store that could serve as a schoolroom. Minnie had a 6-week contract. She intended to honor it, establish the classroom, recruit a permanent replacement teacher through the board's correspondence program, and move on to the next assignment by mid-November. That was the plan. Plans, she had learned, rarely survived contact with the frontier. Redemption Creek had a population of roughly 280 souls, a main street of hard-packed red dirt, a post office, a general store, a church of the Baptist persuasion, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a land office, a doctor's office, a livery stable, and a courthouse that doubled as the town meeting hall. It sat in a broad river valley where cattle country began to give way to farming territory, which meant it was the kind of place where old tensions ran close to the surface, and land was always at the center of any dispute that mattered. The biggest landowner in the area was Patrick Fletcher. Minnie heard his name approximately 4 times in her first hour in town, which was a record even by frontier standards. He owned the Double F Ranch, a cattle operation that covered 12,000 acres north of town, ran approximately 1,800 head of cattle, employed 14 cowboys full-time, and had been the subject of a land dispute with his neighbor, a man named Cornelius Holt, for the better part of 2 years. She heard this from Mrs. Agnes Whitfield at the general store, who offered the information with the freely dispensed authority of a woman who considered herself the social hub of the community. "Mr. Fletcher is a hard man, Mrs. Whitfield said, wrapping Minnie's supply of chalk in brown paper. "Fair, they say, but hard, and right now he is in a considerable amount of trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Minnie asked, because she was genuinely curious and because information was always useful. "Cornelius Holt says Fletcher's men destroyed his irrigation works 3 weeks ago. Says a gang of Double F cowboys rode out in the night and tore up the ditching he built across the South Fork. Flooded his lower fields and killed his winter wheat crop." Mrs. Whitfield leaned across the counter. "Now, whether that is true or not is a matter of some debate in this town. But Holt has gone to the county judge over in Galena about it, and there is talk of criminal proceedings." "And Mr. Fletcher, what does he say?" "Says he was in Wichita on business. Says he can prove it, but he has not proved it yet, and Holt has 2 men who claim they saw Double F riders at the irrigation works that night." Minnie filed this information in the organized library of her mind under the heading of local context, picked up her satchel, and went to inspect her schoolroom. She met Patrick Fletcher the following morning. She was walking north along the main road carrying a rolled-up canvas map of the United States territories that she intended to hang on the schoolroom wall, and she stepped aside to let a horse and rider pass, which was simple frontier courtesy. The rider pulled up instead of passing, and she looked up to find a man on a very large roan horse looking down at her with an expression of mild, assessing attention. He was, she noted with the same calm cataloging that she applied to everything, impressively built. Broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with the kind of hands that come from years of rope work, large and calloused but capable-looking. He had dark hair with a few threads of silver at the temples, which placed him somewhere in his mid-30s. His face was angular and weathered, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone as the Oklahoma bluffs, and dark eyes under heavy brows that were currently aimed at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "You must be the new teacher," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been broken and young and used hard. "I must be," she agreed pleasantly. "Patrick Fletcher." He did not tip his hat, she noticed. He simply told her his name, which somehow communicated more respect than the theatrical gesture would have. "Minnie Carter. You need help with that?" He nodded at the rolled canvas map. "I am managing it perfectly well, thank you." He almost smiled. She could see it at the corner of his mouth, a slight softening that was there and gone in a second. "I have a daughter," he said. "Clara, she is 10. She will be in your school. I look forward to meeting her." He studied her for another moment with those assessing dark eyes, and then he touched the brim of his hat, the only concession to social convention she got out of him, and rode on. She watched him go and noted, with the detached honesty that she applied to herself as readily as to anything else, that Patrick Fletcher was exactly the kind of man she had spent 4 years successfully avoiding. The kind of man who took up too much space in a room. The kind of man whose presence created a kind of gravitational pull that was dangerous for a woman with a traveling contract and a very clear plan for her life. She told herself this very firmly and went to hang her map. The schoolroom opened on Thursday of that week, and 8 children arrived on the first morning, which grew to 14 by the end of the first week, as word spread through the farming and ranching families that the new teacher was serious, capable, and did not tolerate either cruelty or idleness. Clara Fletcher arrived on the second day, a solemn, dark-eyed girl with her father's angular face and her mother's gentle mouth, who sat in the front row and applied herself to every lesson, with the intensity of someone who had been starved for exactly this kind of attention. Minnie recognized in Clara a sharp, hungry intelligence that needed feeding, and she fed it with both hands. Patrick Fletcher came to the schoolhouse on Clara's second Friday to collect his daughter, and he arrived 20 minutes early. Minnie was at the board, writing a grammar exercise, and she was aware of him standing in the doorway. You could not be unaware of Patrick Fletcher standing anywhere. He was simply too present, but she finished what she was writing before she acknowledged him. She heard the slight shift of his weight, the quiet patience of a man who had learned that some things cannot be rushed, and she appreciated it. "She is doing very well," Minnie told him when the children had filed out and Clara was packing her slate and primer. "She is exceptionally bright." "Has she had schooling before?" "Her mother taught her to read," he said. "Her mother died 4 years ago." "I am sorry," she meant it. "Clara has a natural aptitude for numbers in particular. She solves problems by a method I have not taught her. She appears to have arrived at her own system." Something moved across Patrick Fletcher's face at that, a softening that was more profound than the almost smile she had seen the first morning. "Her mother was the same way," he said quietly. "Then she comes by it honestly." He looked at Minnie for a long moment, and she looked back, and the particular quality of that shared gaze, clear, direct, mutually assessing, was something that did not belong in the category of polite frontier interaction. She felt it, and from the slight tension that moved through his jaw, she thought he felt it too. Then Clara appeared at his elbow with her slate, and the moment broke like a soap bubble, clean and total. "Miss Carter gives us homework," Clara announced, with the tone of someone reporting both a complaint and a compliment. "Good," Patrick said. He returned the following Friday and the Friday after that. He always arrived 20 minutes early. He always had a question about Clara's progress, which was genuine, but the questions sometimes extended into other subjects. The territorial education system, the materials the school lacked, whether Minnie found the accommodations above the feed store sufficient. She answered all of it directly and honestly, which he seemed to appreciate because most people, she suspected, told Patrick Fletcher what they thought he wanted to hear. On the third Friday, he brought a crate of school supplies, chalk, slates, 2 McGuffey readers, a box of pencils, without announcement or expectation of gratitude, simply set the crate inside the door and said, "The school needs these. Mr. Fletcher, I cannot accept. Clara needs a proper school." His voice was flat and final. "Consider it a community donation." She considered it exactly that and sent him a formally worded note of thanks through Clara, which she later regretted slightly because it made her sound like a bank correspondent, and she had the distinct sense that Patrick Fletcher found this amusing. On the fourth Friday he lingered after Clara went outside to wait by the horse, and he told her about the land dispute with Cornelius Holt. He did not tell it the way a man tells a story to generate sympathy. He told it plainly and factually, the way she might tell a student about a historical event, including the parts that did not reflect well on him. The boundary dispute with Holt had been going on since 1881. Fletcher had had his survey redone twice. Both surveys confirmed the same thing. The South Fork lay within his property line, and the irrigation works Holt had constructed were built on Fletcher's land without permission. "Did you give him notice to remove them?" Minnie asked. "3 times in writing, with proper legal dates. Do you have copies of those notices?" He looked at her with slight surprise, as though he had not expected her to ask the precise right question. "Yes. Locked in my safe at the ranch. And witnesses to the delivery, too, my foreman Dale Hutchins and the postmaster here in town for the written copies." Then the legal position seems straightforward. The legal position is straightforward. The problem is the accusation. His jaw tightened. "Holt is claiming my men sabotaged his irrigation works, which were built on my land without permission. He is calling it criminal destruction of property, and he has 2 men swearing they saw double F riders at the scene." "Were your men there?" The dark eyes met hers directly. "No, they were not." She believed him, which surprised her because she was not in the habit of simply believing men who said convenient things. She believed him because she had been watching him for 3 weeks, and Patrick Fletcher did not say convenient things. He said true things even when they were uncomfortable. "Where were you?" she asked. "Wichita, October 2nd through October 8th. I was at the stockyards. I have a receipt from the Drovers Hotel and a livestock broker named Samuel Kite who I did business with on the 4th. That establishes your personal whereabouts, not the whereabouts of your men. I know. Who would benefit from this accusation going forward?" He was quiet for a moment. "Holt has been trying to buy the South pasture for 3 years. I won't sell. If he can get a criminal judgment against me, discredit the double F, tie up my legal standing, he might be able to force a sale through the courts on some technical ground. Or simply destroy your reputation enough that the county withdraws your grazing rights." He stared at her. "Yes, exactly that." "Mr. Fletcher," she said, in the same tone she used when a student had finally solved a problem they'd been struggling with for a week, "that is not a simple neighbor dispute. That is a calculated strategy. I know that." His voice was quiet now, and rough with something that was not quite anger and not quite defeat but lived somewhere in the country between them. "I just cannot prove it." She thought about that on the walk home and through most of the evening, which was not, she told herself firmly, because she had developed any personal investment in Patrick Fletcher's situation. It was because her mind, once presented with a problem, did not easily release it. On Saturday morning she went to the land office. The land registrar was a thin, fussy man named Mr. Cornelius Whitmore, no relation to Mrs. Agnes Whitfield, who was clearly uncomfortable with a woman asking to review the county deed and land survey records. She was politely insistent and absolutely clear about her legal right to review public documents, which she knew from memory having read the Oklahoma Territorial Records Act, and he eventually produced the relevant files with the resigned expression of a man who has lost an argument he didn't want to have. She spent 4 hours with those files. She read every deed, every survey record, every boundary notation, and every right-of-way filing associated with the properties along the South Fork of Redemption Creek, going back to the original government survey of 1874. She read the easement applications, the water rights filings, the tax assessment records. She read the original land grant patents. She read the notation in the margin of a 1879 survey amendment that most people would have dismissed as a clerical irregularity. She read everything, and because she was Minnie Carter, she remembered everything. Every word, every number, every date. And when she walked out of the land office into the bright October afternoon, she carried with her the knowledge of a hidden truth that changed the shape of the entire dispute. A truth that was not immediately obvious, that required connecting 4 separate documents across 9 years of records, but that was absolutely there, documented and verifiable, waiting for someone with the right eyes to find it. She intended to think very carefully about what to do with this knowledge. She had a 6-week teaching contract and a professional obligation to remain uninvolved in local disputes. The smart, practical, self-protective thing to do was to complete her contract, organize a replacement teacher, and move on. She told herself this all through Saturday evening and most of Sunday morning. Then on Sunday afternoon, a boy came running to her door with a message written on a torn piece of paper in urgent, cramped handwriting. Patrick Fletcher had been arrested. She read the note twice, set it on the table, and was out the door in 30 seconds with her coat and her satchel. The arrest had happened that morning, barely after dawn. Cornelius Holt's 2 witnesses, men named Grady Sims and Birch Caldwell, who worked for a man named Vernon Lace, who owned a freight operation on the east side of town, had gone to the county judge in Galena the previous week and provided sworn statements. The judge, apparently persuaded by the combination of written testimony and Holt's political connections in the county, had issued a warrant. The Redemption Creek sheriff, a young man named Dale Pruitt who was clearly out of his depth, had served it that morning. Patrick Fletcher was being held at the sheriff's office pending a hearing the following morning. The charge was criminal destruction of property and conspiracy to commit fraud upon a neighboring landowner. If convicted under territorial law, the sentence could include not just substantial fines but imprisonment. And with a prison sentence came the automatic dissolution of grazing rights, which was, Minnie thought, precisely the outcome that Cornelius Holt required. She went to the sheriff's office and was told, politely but firmly, that the prisoner was not receiving visitors. She went to find Fletcher's lawyer. His lawyer was a man named Raymond Cross, who had a small office between the post office and the saddle shop. He was young, perhaps 28, and he had the look of a man carrying more law cases than he was equipped to handle, which the frontier tended to produce. He was also, she quickly determined, not fully aware of the strength of the position that lay dormant in the land records. She told him what she had found, all of it. From memory, with dates and document numbers and margin notations, she laid out the entire legal picture that she had constructed in the land registrar's office on Saturday. Raymond Cross stared at her for a very long time. "You read all of that," he said. "Yes, and you remember it, all of it, every word." "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "you may have just changed the entire nature of this case." The hearing the next morning was supposed to be a preliminary proceeding, a simple establishment of charges and a scheduling of a formal trial date. But Raymond Cross arrived with a legal brief that he had worked through the night to prepare, based entirely on Minnie's recollection of the land records, and the charges took a very different shape in the light of what the records actually said. The irregularity Minnie had found was this. In 1879, the original owner of what was now the Holt property had filed an easement application for water access across the South Fork. The application had been reviewed and conditionally approved, but the approval was contingent on a boundary resurvey that was never completed, because the original owner sold the property to Holt in 1880 before the resurvey could be done. The conditional approval had therefore never become legally effective. This meant that Holt's claim to water access across the South Fork, the very claim that formed the foundation of his argument that the irrigation works were his legal property, rested on a document that had never been legally finalized. More significantly, it meant that Holt's construction of the irrigation works in 1882 was itself unauthorized, which turned his claim of criminal destruction on its head. Fletcher's men had not destroyed legitimate property. They had, assuming they had been there at all, which Fletcher denied, interfered with a structure that should never have been built on Fletcher's land. The hearing room that Monday morning was packed. Word had traveled fast, as word always did in small frontier towns, and the population of Redemption Creek had apparently decided collectively that this was the most interesting thing happening that day. Judge Arlo Dempsey sat at the front with his bought-and paid-for eyes, and Cornelius Holt sat at a table to the right, looking entirely too comfortable for a man whose legal strategy had just had a large hole shot through it. Patrick Fletcher sat at the defense table in the same clothes he had been arrested in, because they had not let him change, with his wrists chained to the table ring. A precaution that Minnie considered both unnecessary and deliberately humiliating, which told her something about the judge and the sheriff, and the shape of the trap that had been laid. Raymond Cross presented the land records argument competently and clearly, citing the documents by number and date, reading from the brief he had prepared. But then the judge, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told Minnie he had been expecting this hearing to go smoothly, and was now recalculating, leaned forward and asked the question she had been afraid he would ask. "Who is your source for these document readings, counselor? Were these records reviewed by a licensed legal professional?" There was a pause. Raymond Cross looked at her. "My source," he said carefully, "is a witness I would like to call at this time, Your Honor." The judge's gaze moved to Minnie, sitting in the gallery. "Tell them what you saw." Patrick Fletcher's voice cracked across the dead silence, his chains pulling taut as he turned toward her. "Tell them, Miss Carter, right now, before they hang me for something I did not do." And she was on her feet and walking forward and taking the witness position that Raymond Cross indicated and facing Judge Dempsey's cold, assessing stare. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear as a church bell in winter air, "I intend to testify, all of it, every word." Holt's lawyer, a heavy man named Prescott who had ridden up from Galena that morning with the confidence of a man who had already won, rose from his chair. "Your Honor, this woman is a schoolteacher. She has no standing as a legal expert. She does not need legal expertise," Raymond Cross said quickly, "to testify to the content of public records she read with her own eyes. The records themselves are the legal authority. She is a witness to their content." The judge's eyes moved between the two lawyers and then back to Minnie. "Are you prepared to swear to the accuracy of your recollection of these documents?" "I am," she said. "Your Honor, I should inform the court that I possess an eidetic memory. I have never testified in a legal proceeding before this moment, but I am prepared to recite verbatim the content of any document in those land records that the court wishes to examine. You may compare my recitation against the original documents, which I would ask the court to have retrieved from the land office for that purpose." There was a sound in the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, something between the two. She kept her eyes on the judge. Dempsey looked at her for a long time. He was a man, she thought, who had been managing this territory for his own benefit for a long time, and he was doing rapid calculations behind those cold eyes, calculating whether her testimony could be discredited, whether the records could be made to disappear before anyone went to retrieve them, whether there was a trap here he could spring. She watched him calculate, and she held very still, the way she had learned to hold still in difficult rooms. "Bailiff," the judge said finally, "send someone to the land office. I want the deed and survey files for the South Fork properties from 1874 to present, all of them." Holt's lawyer sat down. He did not look comfortable anymore. While they waited for the records to be retrieved, Dempsey allowed Minnie to be examined by both lawyers. Prescott, Holt's man, came at her with the particular brand of aggressive condescension that some men used against women they expected to be easily rattled, loud, dismissive, designed to make her doubt herself in front of a crowd. He questioned her training, her qualifications, her right to be reviewing public records at all, and he asked his questions in a tone that implied the answers should be humiliating. She answered every question clearly, precisely, and without the smallest flicker of anxiety, because the questions were easy and the answers were true, and she had learned a long time ago that a man's tone of voice was not the same as the merit of his argument. Patrick Fletcher watched her from the defense table, and she was aware of his gaze the way you are aware of heat, not distractingly, not disruptively, but as a constant, steady presence at the edge of consciousness. The records arrived 40 minutes later, carried by the flustered land registrar, Mr. Whitmore, who looked as though he deeply regretted the entire situation. Judge Dempsey selected the most complex document Minnie had referenced, the 1879 easement application with its conditional approval language and the attached surveying correspondence, and he read it himself, silently, for several minutes. Then he looked up at her. "You claim this document's conditional approval language invalidates Holt's water access claim," he said. "I claim that the document says what it says, Your Honor," she replied calmly. "The interpretation of its legal effect is for the court to determine. But I will note that the condition attached to the approval completion of a boundary resurvey within 18 months was never met, as the accompanying correspondence from the original surveyor, dated March of 1881, confirms. The surveyor wrote to the original property owner requesting payment to complete the resurvey. He received no response. The property changed hands 2 months later. The resurvey was never done. That correspondence is in the file Mr. Whitmore has just delivered." Dempsey found the letter. He read it. His expression, for the first time since the hearing began, showed something that might have been genuine uncertainty. "Your Honor," Raymond Cross said quietly, stepping forward, "I would ask the court to allow Miss Carter to recite the relevant passage from the 1879 easement application, so that her recollection may be compared against the document in the court's possession. If her recollection is accurate word for word, I submit that her testimony regarding other documents she reviewed must be treated as credible." Dempsey set the document face down on his bench. "Miss Carter," he said, "recite the conditional approval language from the 1879 easement application. The full passage." She did. She recited it from the precise moment it had entered her mind on Saturday afternoon, the formal legal language, the clause numbers, the paragraph breaks, the exact wording of the condition, the date notation, the registrar's signature notation, all of it, word for word, as though she were reading from a page only she could see. When she finished, Dempsey turned the document over and read it again. The room was completely silent. He looked up at her, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, the cold calculation in his eyes was replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like awe. "That is verbatim," he said. "Yes," she said simply. Prescott was on his feet again, but the energy in the room had shifted in a way that even a skilled lawyer could not reverse. The crowd, which had come for a spectacle, had gotten one, but not the one anyone expected. And the sympathy of a courtroom crowd is a powerful and fluid thing, and right now it was flowing in one direction. The hearing went on for another 2 hours. Minnie testified about every relevant document she had reviewed: the original 1874 survey, the 1876 property transfer, the 1879 easement application, the 1880 sale to Holt, the 1882 construction records Holt had filed with the land office. In each case, Raymond Cross requested that the relevant document be retrieved and compared, and in each case her recitation was exact. Prescott tried 3 different approaches to discredit her. He questioned whether she might have had access to the documents through improper channels. She explained exactly when she had visited the land office, which Mr. Whitmore confirmed. He questioned whether her memory might be selectively accurate. She invited the court to test any document she had referenced, and the judge accepted the invitation twice more, with the same result. He questioned her motivations, and here he made a mistake, because he implied that she was testifying out of personal romantic interest in the defendant. The room went very quiet at that implication. Minnie looked at Prescott for a measured moment. "I am testifying," she said, "because the documents I read contain the truth of this matter, and withholding that truth would be a disservice to justice and to this community. My motivations are exactly that and nothing more." She paused. "If you have a substantive legal challenge to the content of my testimony, I am happy to address it. If you have only a personal aspersion to offer, I believe the court's time is better spent on the legal questions." Prescott sat down. In the gallery, she heard someone, she thought it was Mrs. Whitfield, make a sound of profound approval. At noon, Judge Dempsey called a recess and retreated to his chambers for 45 minutes. When he returned, his expression was the carefully neutral face of a man who was doing the right thing primarily, because he had calculated that he could not, in this particular case, do anything else. The evidence was documented, the witness was unimpeachable, and the room full of Redemption Creek citizens was watching him with the kind of collective attention that elected officials ignore at their considerable peril. He dismissed the charges, not suspended, not continued pending investigation. Dismissed. The conditional approval's failure to become legally effective, combined with Fletcher's documented alibi placing him in Wichita during the relevant period, combined with the fact that the very structure Holt claimed had been destroyed, was itself an illegal construction on Fletcher's property. The sum of it was more than enough to sink the prosecution's case entirely, and Dempsey, whatever his private alliances, was not willing to ignore all of it in front of a room full of witnesses. The bailiff unlocked Patrick Fletcher's chains. Patrick stood up from the defense table slowly, with the measured care of a man who has been sitting in tension for hours and is not yet quite certain the danger has passed. He turned to Raymond Cross first and shook the young lawyer's hand briefly. Then he turned toward the gallery, and Minnie was standing at the edge of the witness area with her satchel over her shoulder, and their eyes met across the distance of the courtroom, and across the distance of the past 11 days, and across whatever distance had opened between them in all the carefully correct Friday evening conversations, and all the things that had not been said. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at her for a moment in a way that she had never been looked at before in her life, as though she were simultaneously the most astonishing and the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered, and as though he was perfectly fine with both of those things being true. "You memorized 9 years of land records in an afternoon," he said. "It is not particularly difficult for me," she said, which was true but also, she recognized, slightly dishonest, because it was not difficult in the mechanical sense, but it had required her full concentrated attention for 4 hours. "And then you walked into a courtroom in front of a judge who does not like being contradicted and recited them back word for word. The records said what they said. Someone needed to say it." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, people were talking. The gallery was emptying. Cornelius Holt was making his furious way toward the exit with Prescott at his heels. None of it seemed particularly relevant. "Miss Carter," Patrick Fletcher said, in a voice that was lower and rougher and more careful than his usual voice, "I owe you more than I know how to say." "You owe me nothing," she said. "It was the truth. The truth owes no one anything." Nevertheless, he held her gaze. Nevertheless. She left the courthouse before he did because there were things she needed to think about, privately, without the gravitational disturbance of Patrick Fletcher standing close enough that she could smell the dust and leather on him. She walked back to her room above the feed store and sat at her small table with a cup of tea that grew cold while she stared at the wall and had an honest conversation with herself. She had a traveling contract. She had an assignment in Tulsa in December and another in Enid in February. She had built a life that moved, purposefully and by design, because a stationary life had seemed to her, since the death of her father 4 years ago, and the collapse of her engagement to a man in St. Louis, who turned out to value her intelligence only until it inconvenienced him like a trap with a very pleasant exterior. Patrick Fletcher was a man with 12,000 acres of Oklahoma territory, an 8-year-old ranch, a 10-year-old daughter, and the kind of rooted, permanent presence that made a traveling woman's carefully maintained independence feel very fragile and very theoretical. She drank the cold tea and went back to school the next morning. But the thing that had been building between them did not pause for her thinking it over, because things like that do not pause. They simply continue accumulating, the way water accumulates in a low spot quietly, steadily, until suddenly there is a great deal more of it than you expected. Clara came to school that week and told Minnie, with a child's direct and devastating honesty, that her father had been very quiet since the hearing. Not sad quiet, she said. More like thinking quiet. Like when he was working out a problem with the cattle operation, except he kept looking at nothing. What is he looking at? Minnie asked, in what she hoped was a professionally neutral tone. Nothing, Clara said. Just nothing. But in the direction of town, mostly. Minnie was very carefully not thinking about this when Patrick Fletcher appeared at her schoolhouse door on Wednesday, not a Friday, which was unexpected, with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that she had not seen there before. Something open and slightly uncertain that did not sit naturally on the angular landscape of his features, but was, she thought, more honest than almost anything she had seen from him. "I would like to take you for a ride," he said. "If you are willing, the south pasture. I want you to see what you helped save." She should have declined. She looked at him standing there in the doorway with his hat in both hands and the October light behind him, and all of her very reasonable arguments for declining seemed to inhabit a separate, quieter universe that was not the one she was currently standing in. "Give me 10 minutes to dismiss the children early," she said. The south pasture of the Double F Ranch was, in the factual and unpoetic sense of the word, beautiful. Autumn had turned the bluestem grass to copper and bronze, and there were cottonwoods along the creek that had gone entirely gold, and the South Fork moved between its banks with the low, clear sound of late-season water. Cattle grazed in the middle distance, moving with the slow, unhurried confidence of animals that knew where they belonged. Patrick reined in on a low rise above the creek, and they sat there for a while in the easy silence that had, without either of them quite deciding to allow it, become a comfortable habit. "My father homesteaded this in 1866, he said eventually. "Drove a herd up from Texas with 3 other men and his oldest boy, which was me. I was 16. We built the first structure, a cabin, 12 by 14 feet, in 3 weeks in November, which was ambitious to the point of foolishness. But it stood. Has it always been just you running it? My brother helped until 1875. Then he went north to Dakota Territory. We write occasionally. He was quiet. My wife Ellen came from Missouri, schoolteacher actually." Minnie looked at him. "Came out here to teach in Redemption Creek in 1870, he said. Met her in the spring, married her in June. That was not the plan either." He said this last without looking at her, which told her everything about what it was and was not meant to mean. "What happened to her?" Minnie asked gently. "Typhoid, 1879. Clara was 6. His voice was level and quiet, the flatness of a grief that has been lived with long enough to become simply part of the landscape of a person. "She was the strongest person I have ever known. She could do things that made no sense until you thought about them carefully, and then they made perfect sense." He turned to look at Minnie then, and there was something in his eyes that was entirely clear and entirely deliberate. "I recognize that quality," he said. The silence after that was a different kind of silence, warmer and more complicated and entirely impossible to dismiss as nothing. "Patrick," she said, because at some point in the last 2 weeks she had started thinking of him by his first name even though she had not said it aloud until this moment, "I have a contract. I know. I have 2 more assignments after this one. I know that too. I am not the kind of woman who—" She stopped, because she was not entirely sure how to finish that sentence. "Not the kind of woman who stays. Not the kind of woman who is swept along by feeling. Not the kind of woman who, except that all of those things were also not entirely true." "Minnie," he said, and the sound of her first name in his low, rough voice did something complicated to her ability to construct a complete thought. "I am not asking you for anything you do not want to give. I am not asking you to abandon what you do, because what you do matters and anyone who asked you to give it up would be a fool." He paused. "I am telling you that I think about you considerably more than is probably appropriate for the nature of our acquaintance, and I thought you should know that, because you are a person who values honesty, and it seemed dishonest not to say it." She sat with that for a moment, and then she said, with the same directness that she applied to everything. "I think about you considerably more than is appropriate also." Something moved across his face that was not the almost smile or the careful assessment or the open uncertainty. Something warmer and more fundamental than any of those things. He reached across the distance between their horses and offered his hand, not to shake, simply to hold, and she looked at his large, calloused hand for a moment, and then she put her own hand in it. They sat like that for quite a long time, watching the cottonwoods turn gold above the South Fork, while the cattle moved slow and unhurried through the copper grass below them, and the October light went long and amber across the whole wide country. The aftermath of the hearing played out over the following 2 weeks in the way that such things play out in frontier communities. Loudly, with strong opinions distributed across all available social surfaces. Cornelius Holt, stripped of his legal strategy and publicly embarrassed, spent several days in visible fury before retreating to his property, and according to Mrs. Whitfield's reliable intelligence network, composing a letter to his lawyer in Galena about appeal possibilities. His 2 witnesses, Sims and Caldwell, left town quietly on the Thursday after the hearing, which told its own story. The freight operator Vernon Lace, in whose employ the witnesses had apparently worked, left 2 weeks later, which confirmed the story. Raymond Cross told Minnie privately that he was fairly certain Lace had been a paid instrument of Holt's strategy, that Holt had arranged the false witnesses through Lace, and that when the strategy collapsed, Lace found it expedient to remove himself from a town where people were asking questions. She filed this under useful knowledge and said nothing publicly about it, because she had no proof of Lace's direct involvement, and she was not in the habit of making accusations she could not support. Judge Dempsey requested the land records from the registrar's office shortly after the hearing, and over the following month, issued a formal ruling that Holt's irrigation works were an unauthorized construction on Fletcher's land and must be removed at Holt's expense within 90 days. It was, in Minnie's estimation, the judge's attempt to get ahead of what the records already clearly showed. A belated rush toward the right side of history, motivated less by principle than by the recognition that the documentation was now in the public consciousness and could not be conveniently ignored. Holt complied with the removal order, which surprised everyone slightly and probably meant he had received advice from his Galena lawyer about the cost of continuing to fight a paper record that a local schoolteacher could recite from memory on demand. The double F was safe. Minnie's contract ran through the end of October, and then by agreement with the territorial board, it was extended through November while the board searched for a permanent replacement teacher. She wrote her reports on the students' progress, Clara Fletcher's in particular, which she wrote with the particular care of a teacher who recognizes something rare, and she sent her recommendations to the board for the qualities the permanent teacher would need to serve this specific community. During October and November, she saw Patrick Fletcher 5 or 6 times a week, which was approximately 5 or 6 times more than her previous contact with any man who had occupied this particular space in her thoughts. He came to the school on Fridays as before, but now he also came on Wednesday evenings when she had agreed to take supper at the ranch, and on Sunday mornings when they took the same ride to the south pasture that they had taken the first time, which had become something they did not discuss in advance but simply did, reliably, every week. The ranch house was not what she had expected. She had expected a working rancher's house functional, spare, clean in the basic sense and no more. It was functional and spare, but there were books on 3 shelves in the main room and a piano that had been Ellen's in the corner, and a kitchen garden through the back door that Dale Hutchins's wife tended in the summer months. There were small evidences throughout of Ellen Fletcher's presence, a sampler on the wall, a set of good china used on Sundays, a Bible with pressed wildflowers between its pages that Patrick had not removed and apparently did not intend to remove, and Minnie found she respected this profoundly. She and Clara played cribbage on Wednesday evenings after supper, which Clara had learned from her father, and played with the mathematical relentlessness of someone who had been counting cards since she was 7. Minnie won approximately 40% of the games, which she considered a respectable showing against a 10-year-old who was frankly terrifying at cribbage. One Wednesday evening in mid-November, while Clara was asleep and the kitchen fire was banked low, and the last of the autumn wind was running hard across the Oklahoma plains and making the windows flex, Patrick and Minnie sat at the kitchen table with coffee cups between their hands and talked for 3 hours about Ellen, and about Minnie's father, and about what it meant to build something in a place that was still being decided, and about the particular loneliness of being the kind of person who thinks in ways that do not always match the people around them. It was Patrick who said, very quietly, at some point past midnight, "I do not want you to go to Tulsa in December." She looked at him across the table and the firelight and the coffee cups. "I know," she said. "I am not asking you not to go," he said. "I understand what the work means. But I am asking you to consider whether you might come back." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Patrick, what are you asking me to consider exactly?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that he was quiet when he was thinking something through fully before he said it. She had learned this about him. The way his silences had different qualities depending on what was happening behind his eyes. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would consider coming back to Redemption Creek as something other than the traveling teacher, whether you might consider staying." He paused. "With me, with Clara, with the double F, whether you might." Another pause longer. "I am not good at saying things like this." "You are doing quite well," she said. "Minnie Carter." His voice was very low and very direct. "Would you be willing to marry me?" The room was very quiet. The wind moved against the windows. The fire made a small settling sound in the grate. She looked at him. She looked at his angular, weathered face and his dark eyes that were, right now, entirely exposed in a way she thought he did not allow very often, and she thought about everything she knew about Patrick Fletcher, which was, in the way of someone who pays very close attention to the people in front of her, quite a great deal. She thought about the way he had handed her his hand on the rise above the South Fork without asking for anything. She thought about Clara's cribbage face and the pressed flowers in Ellen's Bible and the 3 shelves of books, and the way he listened when she talked, fully, without the slight inattention that most people betrayed when a woman was explaining something complicated. She thought about the traveling contract and the Tulsa assignment and the Enid assignment after that, and all the places on the territorial board's list that needed a teacher and did not currently have one. And she thought, "I am 26 years old and I have been moving for 4 years and I have been alone for longer than that in the way that matters, and I am looking at a man who values the exact things about me that other people found inconvenient, and I think I have been afraid of this not because it is wrong but because it is so precisely right that losing it would be catastrophic." She said, "Patrick Fletcher." "Yes." The sound that went through him was not loud, it was barely audible, a long exhale that carried more relief and feeling than most men allowed themselves in a year, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and he held them with the careful, encompassing firmness of someone who is very aware that the thing he is holding matters. "I will still need to complete the Tulsa contract," she said. "It runs through December. The children there, I know," he said. "Come back in January, and I will want to continue working with the territorial board, on a consulting basis if not a traveling basis. The frontier needs, I know that too. And I will want a proper room for my books, because I have significantly more books than you are currently imagining." That produced the full smile, not the almost smile she had been cataloging for weeks, but the actual complete smile that changed the entire character of his face and that she discovered in this moment she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. "I'll build you a room for your books," he said. "As many as you need." She married him on the 14th of January, 1884, in the Baptist Church in Redemption Creek, with Clara Fletcher standing beside her in a green wool dress that Mrs. Whitfield had helped sew and that Clara wore with the solemn, brilliant dignity of a child who understood that this was important and was not going to cry about it until she got home, because she was her father's daughter and she did not cry in public. Raymond Cross stood with Patrick. Mrs. Whitfield cried enough for everyone. The Territorial Education Board, upon receiving Minnie's letter of professional transition, sent back a letter of congratulations that was formal in its language and warm in every space between the words, and added a note that if she ever wished to consult on curriculum matters or provide legal document review for the territorial education system, they would welcome the correspondence. The wedding supper was at the ranch house, cooked by Dale Hutchins's wife Martha, with the assistance of 5 neighboring women who brought food enough for twice the number of guests, and filled the main room with warmth and noise and the particular joyful chaos of a frontier community celebrating one of its own. Minnie sat at the head of the table that had been Ellen's table in the house that had been Ellen's house, and she felt, she was honest with herself about this, the slight complexity of occupying a space that held another woman's life in it. But she also felt, looking at Patrick across the table with Clara between them, that the right thing was not to erase what had come before but to add to it. Ellen Fletcher had built something real and good in this house, and in this man, and in this daughter. Minnie Carter was not replacing that. She was extending it. She had a conversation with Clara about Ellen on a Sunday afternoon in February, sitting by the kitchen stove while Patrick was out checking the winter water supply. She did not initiate the conversation. Clara did in the direct way that Clara did most things. "Do you mind," Clara asked, "about Mama's things in the house?" "I do not mind," Minnie said. "I am glad they are here. Papa kept them because he said she made the house what it is." Clara was quiet for a moment, tracing a pattern on the kitchen table with one finger. "I was worried you might want to change things." "Some things will change," Minnie said honestly. "That is how life works, but I have no interest in removing your mother from this house. She belongs here." Clara nodded slowly. Then she looked up with her father's eyes. "He is happier," she said. "He whistles now. He did not whistle before." Minnie felt something warm move through her chest. "Does he?" "He has always been good at taking care of things," Clara said, with the evaluative precision of someone who has been watching carefully for a long time. "But you are the first thing that takes care of him back." Minnie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I intend to keep doing that." "Good," Clara said, in a tone that closed the subject with finality and moved directly to requesting help with her arithmetic, which was the most Clara thing possible and therefore exactly right. The winter of 1884 was cold and long, the way Oklahoma winters were, not the brutal polar cold of the northern territories, but a damp, gray, relentless cold that made the plains look stripped and the sky look permanent. Minnie spent it learning the rhythms of the double F, which were different from anything she had known before. The ranch ran on a schedule imposed by the cattle and the seasons rather than by any human preference, and there was a physical, practical reality to it that she found, rather to her own surprise, not oppressive but grounding. She corresponded with the Territorial Education Board twice monthly, and provided 3 written analyses of curriculum needs in the Redemption Creek area that she knew would be used to argue for increased funding in the next session. She continued as an informal advisor to Raymond Cross on land records questions. Several neighboring property owners had approached him about disputes following the Fletcher case, having heard something about a schoolteacher who could read land records, and Raymond found it extremely helpful to be able to call on her knowledge. She taught Clara at home through the winter months, partly because the nearest school was now a 4-mile ride in cold weather, and partly because Clara's level of ability had outpaced what the Redemption Creek School could provide anyway. She worked through mathematics, history, advanced grammar, geography, Latin, and basic natural philosophy, and Clara absorbed it all with the same relentless appetite that Minnie recognized from her own childhood. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it does on the plains. By April, the bluestem was coming up new and bright, and the South Fork was running high from the snow melt, and the double F was in the full urgent business of spring calving, branding, moving the herd to the summer pastures. Minnie learned more about cattle operations in 2 months than she had expected to learn in a lifetime, partly because she was constitutionally unable to be in proximity to something interesting without learning everything about it, and partly because Patrick explained things to her with the same full-attention directness that he brought to everything, without the condescending simplification that some men applied to women asking practical questions. In May, she realized she was expecting a baby. She told Patrick on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen, having made quite certain she was correct in her assessment before she said anything, because she was not someone who made announcements without being sure of her facts. He put down the glass he was holding. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen on him before, something profound and slightly overwhelmed moving through the careful, angular landscape of his face. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his large, calloused hands and pressed his forehead gently against hers. He did not say anything for a while. He did not need to. "Clara will be beside herself," Minnie said against his jaw. "She will absolutely terrorize the infant," he agreed in a voice that was rough with feeling. "I will manage her. I know you will." He pulled back enough to look at her. "Minnie, are you—" "I am entirely well," she said. "And I am happy. I want you to know that. I am deeply, genuinely happy." His hands tightened slightly on her face, and his dark eyes held hers in a way that communicated everything that was too large for words, and she held his gaze and let him see in her expression exactly what she felt, which was something she had not done with any other person in her life with quite this degree of completeness. They told Clara on Saturday morning at breakfast. Clara received the information with an initial moment of perfect stillness, during which she appeared to be running complex calculations, and then she said, "Will it be smart?" Patrick made a sound that was very close to a laugh. "I cannot make any guarantees," Minnie said, "but statistically speaking, given its parents, it has a reasonable chance." "I will teach it cribbage," Clara said decisively, "from the beginning so it learns properly." "That is very generous of you," Minnie said. "Someone has to." The summer was long and hot and full, the way Oklahoma summers are when they are good. Dale Hutchins's new water line, which Patrick had helped him design in response to the changes at the South Fork, was running clean by June. The cattle operation had its best season in 3 years. Patrick said this with the qualified satisfaction of a man who knew better than to celebrate before the year was done, but there was real relief in it. The land dispute with Holt had not resurfaced. Holt had apparently redirected his energy toward a property on the north side of his land that involved a different set of neighbors, and while Minnie thought privately that Holt was simply regrouping, the double F was no longer his immediate target. Raymond Cross stopped by the ranch in August with news from the county seat. Judge Dempsey had announced his retirement, effective at year's end. His replacement was being appointed by the territorial governor, a man named Harrigan from Oklahoma City who had a reputation, Raymond said, for genuine rather than performed impartiality. This was good news for the region. Minnie filed it under favorable developments and returned to the grammar exercise she had been drafting for Clara. In September, Minnie wrote the longest and most detailed curriculum report of her career for the Territorial Education Board, 32 pages on the specific educational needs of rural Oklahoma students, with particular attention to the legal and practical knowledge that frontier children needed and that traditional curricula did not provide. She wrote from 4 years of direct classroom experience and 18 months of observation at the Double F and in Redemption Creek, and she sent it with the confidence of someone who knows that what they are saying is both true and necessary. The board wrote back in October with a letter signed by the superintendent himself, saying that her report had been presented to the territorial legislature and that several of her recommendations were being incorporated into the new territorial curriculum guidelines for 1885. They asked whether she would be willing to serve on an advisory committee. She would. She absolutely would. She wrote that acceptance letter with a particular satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the knowledge that somewhere in a classroom she would never see, a child who would otherwise have missed it was going to have what they needed. Patrick read the superintendent's letter when she showed it to him. He read it all the way through slowly, the way he read things he considered important. Then he looked up at her with an expression that was, by now, one of her favorite things in the world, that particular combination of warmth and respect and something that lived so deep in a person it did not have a simple name. "Advisory committee," he said. "It is not a large role," she said. "Yes, it is," he said. "It is a very large role." He set the letter on the table. "I want you to know, I want to make sure you know that this, what you do and who you are professionally, is not something I consider separate from our life. It is part of our life, and I am proud of it." She looked at him. "Patrick, I am saying it because I want to be sure you hear it." "I hear it," she said, and then, "I love you." She had said it before, but not with quite this particular tone, not with the full, quiet certainty of something that has been tested and confirmed and does not require further argument. He heard the difference. She could see that he heard it. "I love you," he said. Same tone, same certainty. Their son was born on the 10th of November, 1884, in the bedroom of the Double F Ranch house with the assistance of Dr. Eliza Marsh, a capable, no-nonsense woman who had recently arrived in Redemption Creek and whose presence had immediately improved the medical situation considerably. The birth was not easy. It was long and difficult in the way first births often are, and there were several hours during which Minnie was very deliberately not thinking about anything except the immediate task. But the outcome was, as Dr. Marsh announced with professional satisfaction, entirely healthy. Patrick held his son for the first time with his large calloused hands curved around something so small and new that they seemed wrong for the scale of it, and his face did something that Minnie watched from the pillow with perfect attention, a complete and unguarded opening, like a landscape scene without the usual weather. "What will you name him?" Dr. Marsh asked. Patrick looked at Minnie. "James," she said, "for your father." Something moved through Patrick's face. His father, James Fletcher, had homesteaded this land and built the first cabin in November and driven the herd up from Texas with 3 other men and his oldest boy. And he had died in 1876 of a heart that simply wore out, which Patrick had told her about one night with the quiet grief of a man who thought about his father often. "James," Patrick said. His voice was barely audible. "James," Clara confirmed from the doorway, where she had been stationed for the last 2 hours with a determined expression and a blanket she had insisted on carrying, "is an excellent name. I will teach him cribbage as soon as he has hands." "He has hands," Patrick said. "Functional hands," Clara specified. Minnie laughed, which hurt quite a bit but was absolutely worth it. James Fletcher grew into his hands with satisfying speed, the way frontier babies do when the air is good and the food is plentiful, and there are people around who love them extravagantly. Clara, as promised, was an entirely devoted and occasionally overwhelming older sister. She took her role of intellectual mentor with a seriousness that would have been frightening if it had not also been deeply sweet. And by the time James was 2, he could count to 20 and identify the major constellations and beat most adults at a simplified form of card matching that Clara had invented specifically for him. The land dispute with Cornelius Holt came to its final resolution in the spring of 1885. Holt, after losing his appeal to the Galena County Court in February, the new judge, Harrigan, had reviewed the records and confirmed Dempsey's ruling with an additional notation about the clarity of the documentary evidence, put the Holt property up for sale in March. He moved to Kansas City, which several people in Redemption Creek said was exactly where he had always belonged, and others said was the territory's loss, though those others were mostly people who had borrowed money from Holt at some point and were now relieved of the obligation. The sale of the Holt property was purchased partly by two of the farming families along the South Fork, who divided the lower acreage between them. The upper portion adjacent to the Fletcher land was offered to Patrick, who reviewed it with the careful deliberation he applied to major decisions, and then discussed it with Minnie over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. "It adds 3,000 acres, he said on the first evening. "It also adds the debt of the purchase," she said. "What are the terms?" He laid out the financing. She reviewed it with the same attention she had applied to 9 years of land records, and asked the questions that needed asking. And by the third evening, they had reached a decision together that was informed and clear and based on their actual circumstances, rather than either ambition or fear, which was, she had come to understand, the quality of decision-making that distinguished a sound frontier operation from one that looked impressive right up until it collapsed. They bought the upper portion. It was the right choice, and the south pasture in the golden autumn light, running now 3 miles further north than before, was a thing that Patrick looked at sometimes with a quiet satisfaction that she found, she had to admit, somewhat beautiful to witness. Redemption Creek changed in the years that followed, the way frontier towns changed when they were growing into something more permanent. The permanent school building was completed in 1886, with 4 classrooms and an actual library that Minnie had campaigned for through the territorial board, until the funding was allocated. She was on the school board from its founding and served as chair of the curriculum committee, which she approached with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. The children of Redemption Creek received, as a result, an education that was significantly better than the territorial average, and several of them went on to do notable things, though that is a story for another time. Raymond Cross's legal practice grew steadily in the wake of the Fletcher case, which had, improbably, become something of a reference point in territorial land law. He married a young woman from Missouri in 1886 and asked Minnie to review his first major land rights brief for errors, which she did, finding 4, and he thanked her with the slightly awed gratitude of a man who is genuinely glad he had the sense to ask. Dr. Eliza Marsh stayed in Redemption Creek permanently and became, along with Minnie and Mrs. Whitfield, one of the 3 most influential women in the community's social and practical life. The 3 of them drove the establishment of a lending library, a women's improvement society, and a petition to the territorial legislature regarding educational funding that was, by any measure, extremely effective, and that Patrick described privately as the most politely devastating political document he had ever read. "You wrote most of it," Minnie pointed out. "I know," he said. "That is what I mean." Clara Fletcher, at 14, was the most educated young person in Redemption Creek by a considerable margin, and was reading books that most adults in the territory had not encountered. Minnie had been corresponding on her behalf with the Kansas State Normal School, which had recently begun accepting female students, and in the spring of 1889, Clara was offered a place in the teacher training program, the youngest applicant they had ever considered, and the only one whose entrance examination had reportedly made the admissions board pause and read it twice. Clara left for Emporia, Kansas in September of 1889, with a trunk packed with books and a composure that lasted exactly until the stage pulled away from the Redemption Creek stop, and then, Minnie thought, probably not much longer after that. She was 17. She was entirely ready. She was also, Minnie knew with the certainty of someone who had watched her for 5 years, going to be extraordinary. Patrick watched the stage go with the quiet, still face of a man who is managing a very large feeling with considerable skill. "She will write every week," Minnie told him. "She will write every 3 days," he said. "She has things to say." This was accurate. Clara wrote every 3 to 4 days, detailed letters full of observations about her classes and her professors and her fellow students, and the city of Emporia, and the books she was reading, and the arguments she was having, and the ideas she was developing. And Minnie read each one with the pleasure of someone watching something they helped build continue to grow. By the autumn of 1889, James was 5 and very firmly his own person, which was clear from approximately the moment he began talking and showed no sign of changing. He had Patrick's physical solidity, already broad through the shoulders for his age, always moving, always engaged with the physical world, and something of Minnie's relentless curiosity, combined with a social ease that seemed to be entirely his own invention. He made friends with everyone and forgot no one, and he had inherited, to a lesser degree, something of his mother's retention, not the precise eidetic quality, but a very good memory for things he cared about, which at 5 years old was primarily cattle, horses, cribbage, and the exact contents of every book he had been read. In November of 1889, James Fletcher was joined by a sister, Eleanor, named for no one in particular, a name that Minnie had simply always liked for the way it felt in the mouth, with a slight old-world gravity to it, arrived in the world with considerably less drama than her brother had, as though she had assessed the situation from the outside and decided that efficiency was preferable. Dr. Marsh said she had never attended a more straightforward birth in 20 years of practice, which Minnie considered a compliment in the same spirit it was offered. Eleanor had her mother's greenish-brown eyes, and from extremely early on, an expression of cool evaluative attention that made visitors to the ranch feel slightly as though they were being assessed for some purpose they had not been informed of. Patrick said this was familiar. James, upon being introduced to his sister, looked at her for a long moment and then said, "She is looking at me like she already knows things." "She might," Minnie said. "Unsettling," James said. He was devoted to her within a week. The Double F in the early 1890s was the most prosperous it had ever been. The cattle operation was sound and growing with appropriate caution. The additional land from the Holt purchase had turned out, after several years of careful management, to be more valuable than either the price or the initial assessment had suggested. There was a spring on the north edge of the property that fed a reliable water source through even the driest summer months, which was more valuable than almost anything else on the frontier. Patrick had worked it steadily and well, with Dale Hutchins beside him and a crew of cowboys who stayed because they were paid fairly and worked for a man who said what he meant. The land dispute, the arrest, the hearing, the chains on Patrick's wrists, and the cold calculation in Judge Dempsey's eyes, all of that lived now in the settled country of the past. A story that people in Redemption Creek told occasionally with the particular relish that communities apply to events that tested them, and that they, collectively, can feel they passed. The version that circulated involved Minnie's testimony in terms that had grown somewhat more dramatic with each retelling, and while Minnie herself always corrected the wilder embellishments when she heard them, she had privately accepted that some version of the story was going to live in this town's memory for a long time. She did not mind, not because she needed to be remembered, but because the thing the story pointed to, that a woman's knowledge and capability had mattered, had made a difference in a courtroom that had not expected to take her seriously, that was worth remembering. It might make the next woman who walked into a difficult room feel slightly less alone in it. On a Friday evening in October of 1892, Minnie sat at the kitchen table of the Double F with two things in front of her. A letter from Clara at normal school, she was in her 3rd year, had just published a monograph on frontier educational methodology in a regional education journal, and was considering a position in the new Oklahoma Territory school system, and a letter from the Territorial Education Board, requesting that she consider a more formal advisory role in curriculum development for the 1893 academic year, with a small honorarium and the possibility of occasional travel to Oklahoma City for committee meetings. She sat with both letters and the particular quality of October evening light that came through the west window of the ranch kitchen, warm and long and almost amber. And she was aware of the sound of Patrick's boots on the porch boards and then the door, and the way the room shifted slightly when he came into it, as it always did, as she thought it probably always would. He saw the letters on the table. He came to stand behind her and read over her shoulder. She felt the warmth of him, and then he put both hands on her shoulders with the familiar, easy weight of someone who knows where they belong. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that I would very much like to take the advisory role." "Then take it. The travel to Oklahoma City, Martha Hutchins will help with the children when you need to go. Eleanor thinks Martha hung the moon. James can come with me on the range some days, he has been asking." "He has been asking for a year," Minnie said. "He is patient, like his mother." She turned to look up at him from her chair, and he looked down at her with the dark eyes that she had been reading for 9 years now, and could read as well as any document she had ever committed to memory. Better, because this was not static text on a page. This was a living thing that grew and changed and revealed new pages every day, and she thought she would spend the rest of her life reading it and not exhaust the material. "I love you," she said, as simply as she had said it the first time, and with the same full certainty that had grown with each passing year, the way the south pasture had grown steadily, solidly, with good ground under it. He bent and pressed his lips to the top of her head, which was not a dramatic gesture, but was one of the things she loved most about him. The way affection moved through him easily and without announcement, the way he did not perform it but simply expressed it, as naturally as breathing. "I love you," he said against her hair, "advisory committee and all." She made a small sound that was very close to a laugh. "That is not a qualification." "It is not," he agreed. "I mean without qualifications, everything that you are. Eidetic memory, land records, legal testimony, curriculum reports, cribbage losses to Clara, all of it, the whole Minnie Carter." "Minnie Fletcher," she said. "Yes," he said, "Minnie Fletcher, God help this territory." She laughed properly then, full and clear, and outside the west window the Oklahoma evening was all amber and copper, and somewhere in the south pasture the cattle were moving to the water line, and in her room Eleanor was probably building something inadvisable with wooden blocks, and James was probably in the barn with Dale's youngest talking about horses, and Clara's letters were on the table in the warm light. The trap had not held them. The betrayal had been answered by truth. The dark past of chains and a rigged courtroom and a judge with bought eyes had resolved into this kitchen, this man, this evening, this life that she had not planned and that was better for the planning's absence. She had memorized everything. She had said what she knew, and everything after that had been, she thought, the exact thing that truth, properly applied, sometimes makes possible. The life they had built was not without its hard days. The winter of 1893 brought a cattle sickness that cost them 17 head before Dr. Marsh found a neighboring veterinarian who knew what it was and how to stop it. And the drought of 1895 tested the ranch's reserves in ways that required careful management and some difficult decisions about which projects to delay. But the foundation was sound, and they faced each hard thing together in the direct, clear-eyed way that had characterized them from the beginning, and none of it broke them. Clara came home from normal school in the spring of 1893 with her teaching certificate and a manner that had acquired a professional polish without losing a single degree of the underlying sharpness. She accepted a position with the Oklahoma Territory School System as a district curriculum coordinator, which brought her back to the Redemption Creek area, and she visited the ranch most Sundays and played cribbage with James and Eleanor with the competitive intensity that had apparently not been diminished by 3 years of higher education. James Fletcher, at 9 years old, could ride, rope, and read a land map, and was working through his mother's copy of Euclid's Elements with the cheerful determination of someone who regarded mathematical difficulty as an interesting puzzle rather than an obstacle. Minnie Fletcher, at 4, had already mastered reading and was working through picture books with a speed that caused Mrs. Whitfield to say, on a Sunday morning when Minnie read aloud from the church bulletin without being asked, that the Fletcher children were clearly the product of some very specific and continuing miracle. Or good teaching, Dr. Marsh said dryly. Same thing, Mrs. Whitfield said, with the decisive authority she applied to all statements she considered self-evident. Minnie, on the advisory committee for the Territorial Education Board, wrote 3 more major reports in the early 1890s. The second one, on the specific educational and legal knowledge needs of frontier women, circulated beyond the territory entirely, and was cited in an educational reform paper presented in Washington, D.C. in 1894, which she heard about from the superintendent by letter, and which struck her as both gratifying and entirely abstract compared to the concrete daily reality of the students in front of her. But she knew that the abstract things and the concrete things were connected. That the document she wrote at the ranch kitchen table in November became the classroom resource in January, and the classroom resource became the child who walked into the world in June knowing something they would not otherwise have known. The chain was long and the individual links were small, but the chain was real and it mattered. She knew this the same way she knew that a conditional approval in an 1879 easement application could save a man's ranch and change a woman's life, and set a child on a path toward a normal school and create, by a chain of circumstances none of them could have predicted, a Sunday morning when a 4-year-old girl read aloud from a church bulletin in a voice that carried clearly to the back row, and made the whole congregation go quietly still for a moment, simply listening. In December of 1895, on a cold and clear night when the stars over the double F were the kind of stars you only see when the sky is truly dark and truly cold, Patrick and Minnie sat on the porch after the children were in bed, wrapped in heavy coats and sharing a blanket across their laps, and they watched the stars the way they sometimes did, without agenda, without conversation, simply present in the same place at the same time, which had been their particular luxury for 11 years. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked after a long and comfortable silence. She considered the question with the same honest attention she gave everything. "No," she said, "not one. The traveling contract. The assignments you did not take. The assignments I did not take led to other things, better things." She looked at him. "Do you?" "I regret," he said slowly, "that I did not find a better way to thank you that first day. After the hearing, I was not in a state to be eloquent." "You managed," she said. "You told me it was verbatim. That is not a love declaration." "It was from you," she said. "I knew what it meant." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What did it mean?" "It meant," she said, "that you were looking at me the way no one had looked at me before, not at what I could do for you, at what I was." She paused. "Most people who were impressed by my memory found it useful. You found it astonished you in a way that was personal, like you had been looking for something for a long time and were surprised to find it." The silence after that was warm and full, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have shared enough truth that they can afford to leave some things unsaid. "I had been," he said finally. "I know," she said. "So had I." The stars moved in their long, slow arc across the Oklahoma sky, and the ranch was quiet around them, cattle in the south pasture, horses in the barn, 2 children asleep in the warm house, a daughter grown and at work in the territory she had come from. The South Fork ran below the ridge, clean and clear, running exactly where it should run, the legal questions around it settled and done and permanently recorded in the documents that Minnie Carter Fletcher could recite from memory if anyone ever asked. Nobody asked anymore. But she remembered anyway, as she remembered everything, as she always would, every word, every date, every margin notation. Every document that she had ever read in 4 years of traveling and 11 years of settling, and every year in between that had been, by some confluence of truth and courage and an extraordinary gift and a man on a roan horse who stopped to talk instead of simply riding past, exactly what life was supposed to be. Exactly that. And not one word less.